Hello, welcome to the Colors for Crafts podcast, the podcast that aims to educate, inform, and engage our audiences about the meanings of color, textile, and craft coloration practices, and the future of color through research, education, and experiences stemming from the Colors for Crafts project based at the University of Helsinki. I am your host, Dr. Dustin Neighbors. In this episode, I am joined by Riina Rammo, Liis Luhamaa, and Debbie Bamford from the Colors for Crafts consortium to talk about traditional textile and dyeing practices and the Colors for Crafts project. Join us as we discuss the history of textile crafts, experimental research methods related to traditional dyeing practices, past meanings of color, and the role of this research in the Colors for Crafts project. Please allow me to introduce our guest. Dr. Riina Rammo is Associate Professor in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Tartu and the leader of the History and Tradition Work Group in the Colors for Crafts project. As an archaeologist, her primary research interests lie in archaeological textiles, with particular attention on technology, clothing, and issues related to preservation. With her expert knowledge of Estonian archives and archaeological collection, Riina has extensively worked on and analyzed textile dyes in medieval and post-medieval Estonian archaeological textile finds and fragments. Dr. Liis Luhamaa is a craft specialist and practical dyer with a background in biology and environmental technology. Additionally, she holds a master's degree from the Department of Native Crafts in the Viljandi Culture Academy at the University of Tartu. She is currently a textile specialist and researcher in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Tartu. Her research focuses on the topic of Estonian folk costume, and she conducts research on historical clothing, particularly examining the colors used in these traditional textiles. Debbie Bamford, also known as the Mulberry Dyer, is an experienced professional dyer working as a consultant for industrial organizations and companies in the UK. She has meticulously researched history of natural dyes and dyeing methods, resulting in the development of historically reproduced naturally dyed silks that can be seen at the V&A Museum, Hampton Court Palace, and other museums and historic houses across the UK and Europe. Debbie is currently a PhD researcher at the University of Leeds, investigating methods for improving the Mordanting process for natural dyes on cotton and wool and color fastness of naturally dyed textiles. Riina, Liis, Debbie, welcome. I am delighted to have my guest to talk about the history of textile craft, meaning of color, and traditional dyeing practices. So to begin, I just want to get to know you, and for our listeners to get to know you. How are each of you connected to historical textile crafts, dyeing practices, and color?
I can start. My name is Riina. I'm working at the University of Tartu in Estonia, and I am an archaeologist working with textiles. So to study textile crafts, traditional textile crafts, including dyeing, I think this is something I am doing.
And Liis?
I first started dyeing a long time ago with plants already about 20 years ago. And there was no specific reason I started. It just seemed something that's really interesting. I was considering a career change at the time. So I was looking for something that I could do being at home because I had small children, and something that I would maybe be good at as a person having education in biology. So dyeing with plants seemed one possibility. And so I started dyeing, I learned about dyeing, and then I started doing workshops. And only in the recent years, since 2017, when I started making Estonian folk costumes for myself, I really looked into historical dyes and historical dye methods that have been used in Estonia. And it all led to me being part of this project and working really scientific methods and searching all this scientifically and discovering many things about Estonian dyeing technologies and dyes used that I didn't know before.
Debbie?
I started from a reenactment point of view. When my boys were young, I joined a reenactment group, and because of their age, I couldn't go on the battlefield, so I had to give myself a character and decided I'd be a 17th century embroideress. From that, I realised that I couldn't actually find the correct embroidery threads, so I learnt to spin and dye my own. Luckily, there are texts that date to around that period, so I had at least got recipes to look at, took it from there and did an awful lot of experimental work and reading and studying how to do the dyeing. By chance, somebody said, "Where do you get your threads from?" And I said, "Well, I make them." And they said, could they buy them? And then after that, I got a commission to go and work for the V&A, doing some embroidery threads for them. And so kind of like Topsy, it grew. And I now actually consider myself a medieval dyer because I am absolutely fascinated and passionate about learning about the history of dyes.
So this is really interesting because you all come at this from personal perspective, but also from different disciplines as well. I've had this question approached to me many times, which is, what's the difference between archaeology and history? And before I would have said, history is looking at documents, images, whereas archaeologists are using the actual culture, the environment of cultural heritage, objects, artifacts. Would you agree with that?
Yes, in general, if we have to draw borders, it's good definition of these two disciplines, history and archaeology, in academia. But if you are really studying something, then these borders are not good, and I try to overcome this. So if I have a research question, I just use everything, because everything available, all the written sources, pictorial sources, archaeological sources. I think history and archaeology are both studying fast. Sometimes there are no borders between the two.
I definitely think that now that we get, as history has developed, as the fields have developed, there is a lot of cross-border areas in research. And I think more recently, I've been using a lot of the archaeological practices. For our listeners, I work with this wonderful team. My contribution to this is I work on the historical clothing that was used in cultural practices such as hunting, of women hunting in the early modern period. And so my approach to this has been more recent. Within the last couple of years, I've started looking at more objects of clothing, and I have been able to help and contribute in a small way to our working group on history and traditional practices. So what do we mean by textile craft? What all is involved in creating textiles?
Well, I think that textiles encompass every aspect of dealing with fibres and taking them through into a piece of textile, from the growing of the plant or the growing of the fibre on the hair, on the wool, or on the sheep, or whichever animal, and from the knowledge of that, taking it right the way through the processing, the spinning, dyeing, the weaving, the whole thing.
I do feel it's very important, especially when researching historical textile, to also take into account all the differences within one fiber group. For example, when using wool, never just wool. It can be long wool, it can be fine wool, it can be very coarse wool. I feel very lucky that I can spin and process the fibers myself, because this gives me a lot of information. So having been processing wool, spinning wool, and getting the yarn, I can look at historical textiles, see the yarns that have been used to make these textiles, and then think back, what was the spinning technique used? What was the wool processing method used and what was the wool, how did the wool fiber look like probably. And it gives me a lot of extra information that someone maybe doesn't think of these many, many differences in material.
And for me, craft means always people, because I am interested in the persons who did textiles in the past, all related with those actors, how they acted and what was the society and how it.
When you say it's people, makes us think about what people actually do and using their hands and actually creating something that's not necessarily machine involved, but has people involved in using their hands, using their own knowledge. And I think one of the things that points out to all of your replies is that it seems like textiles, crafts, and the creation of and studying these aspects of it requires a lot of different knowledge from different disciplines. One of the things that I would say for history, it involved a lot of different interdisciplinary knowledge that you need to have or you've gained through the process of working and studying. That ties into the next question, which is how were textiles dyed in the past and how were dyes made?
Well, the dyes came from the plant. Somebody must have dried plant and stuck it in some water and see what happens. I guess they noticed that the insects were kind of giving a colour when they got them on their hands and tried to knock them off or something, I guess. It's got to have been experimental to start with. And then somebody would have said, oh, well, look, that's worked. Let's try something else. Then, I mean, obviously, then the archaeology comes into it and you can see traces of dye in pots, or you can work out where was a dye house. They know there was a dye house in, I can't remember if it's Pompeii or Herculaneum now. And we know there was a dye works in Coppergate. So experiment and then actually taking it further.
The main process of dyeing with plants is very simple and straightforward. Like Debbie said, you just boil a plant in water usually, and then you put the textile in the dye bath and boil it some more. But it can get very complicated as well with some dyes like indigo. As for how they were made, so first they were just collected, something that was growing around you. And then at some point when dye industry grew, they also started to import dyes from further away because you needed good dyes that gave you good lasting color or specific shades of color. And this is how it all grew.
One of the things that you all have taught me is what is used and how you create it, because you talk about it being a very complex process, and the use of human urine in the process and why you use urine.
So I already mentioned indigo, and indigo is a pigment, which means the difference between dyes and pigment is that dyes dissolve in water, and when they are dissolved in water, they can also like go into the fibers and touch there. So this is the process of dyeing. But indigo pigment, it doesn't dissolve in water, and therefore it can't attach to the fiber as a dye. So you need to dissolve it somehow. And how it dissolves is that you have to have a liquid that's alkaline, and the pigment, the molecule of the pigment itself, it has to be reduced. So you need a chemical process. And the urine, very simple. So when you let it become stale, so keeping it for 2-3 weeks, and then the uric acid in urine turns into ammonia, which is alkaline. And there are bacterials living in the urine that take care of the reduction. So it's actually a very elegant method of a simple method of dyeing with this complicated indigo dye by using urine. You have everything that's needed. You don't have to buy anything. You can just collect it, and then you can dye the most beautiful permanent blue dye.
I don't know that I would call urine elegant, but I see what you're saying. It's a more elevated process. What shocks me, and I didn't learn this and I didn't recognize it, is the fact that if we think about the past, they're using things that they have access to, the things that are in everyday life. And I don't know why. I didn't think naturally bodily functions was part of that everyday life. You use it when most of us nowadays is like, we don't reuse that. But as dyers, you do use that today. Is that correct?
Well, in the history, it wasn't only used in domestic dyeing, it was used in very big industrial scale.
The first dye houses, men's urinals, were attached to the dye works so the pipes went directly into a holding tank. No ladies, only men. So, yeah.
You heard it here, folks. Urine is part of the everyday life in the past and maybe even today. That's really interesting when we think about what's all involved, because Liis, I remember when you were talking at the Textile Dye for Tomorrow seminar, one of the things you really emphasized, what we think is natural or easy is actually very complex, involves a lot of knowledge, a lot of practice. And so that ties into this next question. How do you actually research the history of textile craft and traditional dyeing practice?
Well, I started with books. The English Housewife by Gervase Markham, who teaches you how to dye a puke. I'm still trying to work out whether we're actually dyeing the rejected food or we're producing the colour that comes from rejected food. But he is a 17th century man who was teaching women how to run their household, basically. But he has dye recipes in there. And then you've got Rossetti from the 16th century, and obviously the Stockholm and Leyden papyri from the 4th, 5th century. One of the problems with historical dye recipes, though, is that a lot of it was known. You learnt from a young age if you were going into dyeing, and you would have things that you just did on such a regular basis. Nobody thought it was necessary to write it down. So you just wouldn't see that bit, or they'd say, dye in the usual manner or whatever. So you don't have complete recipes. I don't think Rossetti actually was a dyer. I think he may have been just writing down what he was watching, because some of the recipes don't make sense. Some of them work very well, but it is quite a complex thing to try and actually reproduce some of the recipes. You have to kind of learn a lot as you're going along and experiment. Yeah, there is a lot of information out there.
For me as well, written text as well as my own experiments are main methods of research. And so one archival source I like a lot are the dialect texts that were collected not for the purpose of getting information, but for studying language and the dialect. And the researchers, they just needed their language guides to talk about anything. And very often they asked about traditional handicrafts. And we have in Estonian Language Institute this really big resource, huge catalog of paper slips with keywords written on them. And every keyword also has this example how this word was used as a text. If you know your keywords, well, you usually know the dye names, you know the dye plants that were used. You can look them up and see what's extra information is on the slip. And what I especially as a researcher love about the dialect text is that they are written down word by word, exactly as the person told them, because the ethnographic text often are just what the researcher remembered that he or she was told.
I, as an archaeologist, I start always with real artifacts, with archaeological finds and textiles. So the way how to get knowledge about dyes is to make analysis, chemical analysis. And it's also a very fascinating branch of research, because unfortunately there is no machine which would say you that, oh, this textile was dyed with gold or this textile was dyed with madder. But there is a lot of information you can get from the analysis, and you have to interpret them. And this is really interesting and complicated, and you have to know a lot about the historical context and everything, and you have to synthesize all the information.
We're not talking about physical, we're not talking about the knowledge aspect and the written, but we're also looking at the physical and objects and the textiles that survive. And it does beg the question of what happened in the case when there is nothing surviving. How do we recover that information? And one of the points that you just brought out, Riina, and you as well, Liis, is about the knowledge and knowledge that we gain from looking at the materials, but also reproducing it. And it's one of the things that came up when I was looking in Tartu. We were talking about the belt, and we were talking about, and we saw them in the archival part, and we saw that in the store. And I was very interested to know, are these patterns teaching something, conveying something? Is there meaning behind it? What knowledge comes from these patterns?
So quite often we don't know anymore what specific patterns meant, or if they were just patterns or they had a deeper meaning. Sometimes we do. Sometimes they have names, so we can deduct the meaning. And for example, some belts in Kihnu Island, they have this pattern that they call wolf's teeth, so referencing to the teeth of the wolf, but could also give, for example, a protective meaning, because you had the teeth of the wolves that were protecting you. Sometimes it is written down, often it's not anymore. And these references to nature that was all around the people are quite common. Many dye names, old dye names in Estonian are actually names, the dyes that you can see in nature. Even old name for dye in Estonian is hair. So it's not dye, it's like hair. It's like the color of the animals around you. And there are some really fascinating dye names, old dye names, like the color of pike perch. So like a fish, and in dictionaries you have to have a long explanation what is the color, so that it's the color like this fish's skin. It's even gray, but it has some yellow spots in it.
When we think about what people do, it's always connected to their culture and the world around them. So it also begs the question that I've been wondering, digging into the research that I've been contributing, is this idea of cultural transfer, cultural knowledge that's being exchanged, and where do these practices start or come from? Debbie, I'm assuming, and based on what we've talked about, is that there are practices in the UK that happen in dyeing practices and textile creation practices that happen in the UK. Is it similar in Estonia? Are there different practices? There's different tools that are used, such as copper pots, clay pots. Are there different things that are used? Do we see any differences between these practices?
In general, I think way of dyeing is quite similar. It comes from the nature, it comes from the chemistry. There are some things that are working and some things that are not. So people in general are doing it the same way, but of course in details we have differences. For example, plants are different, or the sources are different because nature is different. Maybe pots are different, I don't know, because we do not have enough information on this topic in Estonia. And related belief, this is something that comes from the culture.
We have archaeological evidence of dye houses and how they were set up, don't we? And we know we've found the pots at Coppergate that had madder in the bottom, so they were definitely using clay pots in the medieval period. Whether they were using the same ones in other parts of Europe, I don't know whether anybody's actually done a comparison in that sort of way. There is evidence of dyeing being done in different places, isn't there?
Well, then we just uncovered a new aspect that maybe someone needs to work on at some point.
The research into dyeing in Estonia has been quite poor, may I say. So it's not a well-researched area. We do know that we didn't have many dye houses and dyers from the early modern period, and that I also think that the evidence shows that quite old traditional dye methods survived here or were used for a long period until the 19th century. And this was the time when the written sources are coming in the 18th and 19th century about Estonian peasants. So we have, I think, quite interesting material and information about very ancient dye method that could be very ancient. where you don't use any bought materials and you use only what you can gather from your environment.
I really like that when we think about the dye stuff and the use of dye stuff that has its own knowledge, but also in researching the dissemination of dye stuff throughout Europe and the routes that they traveled. There's information that goes with that, with those products, with those ingredients that are spread throughout. That's the cultural transfer of knowledge in that way, of just through trade and dissemination as well. And I think that's something fascinating that we are incorporating into the research and the history and archaeology work group. When we're thinking about, and we've been talking about the different dye stuffs, Debbie, you and Liis have both mentioned it a couple of times already. How do experimental research methods, particularly in the fields of archaeology and history, help us to identify and make sense of past textile crafts and traditional dyeing practices?
Although I am researching mostly like historical methods from the 18th and 19th century, where we already have things written down, if we're really lucky, also recipes, there are still many unanswered questions, information you don't get from these sources. And one example could be the research on dyeing with rotted aldebuckthorn bark. So aldebuckthorn, it's this small tree, and its bark was used for dyeing in Europe and in Estonia. We found these sources telling that in Estonia, you had to rot the bark before dyeing to get the red from aldebuckthorn bark, because just using the bark dried, you get yellow, and red, of course, is a much more interesting and much more valued color. We knew that you have to rot it, and we knew that you can get red, but what we don't know is, for example, how long to rot it to get red, which were the necessary conditions, then how much to use the bark for dyeing so that you get red, and lastly, the shade of red that you get, because red is such a broad term. It can be purplish, it can be more orange. These are the questions you can only answer with doing experimental research.
I really think that's fascinating that you're actually recreating and walking in the steps. It's all about precise measurements, and it's all about doing this the right way or it doesn't work out. That to me is a long and difficult process, because then you have to start all over again. That's something you can identify through the experimental process.
You'd apply it to whether you were applying the dyes now or doing an experiment, though. You should always make notes about what you're actually doing and how you've done it.
But this is what makes it scientific, a scientific method, that you're writing everything down and you're making sure that it's reproducible. And other people as well can control whether what you're saying, that you can get red from rotted aldebuckthorn bark, does it really work? So how did you do it? This is about not just playing around, but again, writing it down in very clear terms, in very clear measurements, so that others can check your work.
So speaking about experiments, I think research questions are very important. So it's just not playing around, but you have a question and you are searching answer for it. I think it's very important.
I think the analysis side of it as well is quite important when you're doing the experimental side, because you can look at a historical textile and then you can analyse what dyes were used, but it doesn't tell you quantities or any of the measurements, just it will tell you only what the dye or complex of dyes was. So you still need to do the experiments to actually work out how they achieve that colour.
And get the references to test or to compare to.
And I think that's the main point. I think it shouldn't be seen, experimental research should not be seen as, something of playing around, but you have to make sure it's reproducible, but also the knowledge that you gain from not just doing the practice, but in preparing for the practice of collecting the dye stuff, the knowledge. And that's one thing, Liis, you really hit on in the seminar I mentioned again, that knowledge is all complex, but it's knowledge that you have to have in order to be able, and it's only through the practice of trial and error. And that's what I think experimental research should be about, or should be seen as that trial and error of recreating, of reproduction. When we think about the experimental research practice, then we think about the research of history. oftentimes we may get people that encounter and say, well, why does it matter that we recover textile craft skills and practices? Why is it important?
I don't think we should ever lose them. I think it's very important not to lose skills. So we need to keep them going. Heritage Crafts Association here in the UK have a red list of endangered crafts, and they are looking to get people to go on apprenticeships to learn how to do those crafts so that we don't lose them. We may want to improve the historical methods. We may look at different ways of doing things, but the actual skills are so important. Something like spinning, no matter how you do it, whether you use a drop spindle or you use a spinning wheel or you use a modern cotton spinning or wool spinning machinery, it's still the same thing that's happening, and you still need that fibre to gain its strength by being spun. By maintaining the crafts, you might actually see, if you went a slightly different way, you could improve it even up to the modern machinery if you know how it was done originally.
When we research historical textiles and the researcher has practical abilities, or is a dyer, is a spinner, is a weaver, then the information you get and the questions you start to ask are much more thorough, go into much more depth, and some pieces of information that say nothing special to someone who's not, for example, researching dyes, say much more to a dyer. So if I read, for example, say from the 17th century, that the peasant had a cloth that was blue, then like a historian may not think it's something special. But for me, for someone who knows the dyes, it's there is a lot of information in this piece that it's blue, because it shows me first that it's probably dyed with indigo, which doesn't grow in Estonia, which had to be imported. Therefore, the person had to buy either the dye or the cloth, which means they had to have enough money for this. So there's another field of information that's opening up if you know the background.
I completely agree with you when you sit here and say, or when you bring up the point that there's some historians that say, well, that's not useful to me. And what I'm finding more often than not is disregarding certain things. Oh, because that's not relevant to me. It will be, because as we develop in our career, we develop research, and if we are expanding researchers, we'll come to a point, and I've been in that case where before I was, reading descriptions of people hunting, and I never thought about the clothes. I was thinking about the action or the actual animals or the interactions that were happening. But comes to find out, I then have to start thinking about, well, how did these objects or what they were wearing impact or deal with the actual person doing the hunting? Did it hinder them? And I'm thinking these elaborate dresses that they would have worn would not have been practical for hunting. You couldn't do that. The arms were very restrictive. So, and I'm like, what I just counted before, clothing is not really that important. Actually, it is. You have to start thinking about how it was used. You have to think about the construction. You have to think about the material. Is it durable? Is it going to last long? And these are the questions that I started delving into. So I think, Liis, is a very great point, is that we shouldn't discount it just because, but it asks the questions that may be relevant later on and that can be utilized by other people.
There's also the aspects of where did the word come from? I'm thinking of something like scarlet today as being a red colour. Actually, it was a type of cloth. So it wasn't even, the type of cloth was dyed with kermes and was a red colour, but it wasn't that colour, and the words changed. So it gives us the history of certain words as well when we look at.
Absolutely. If we think about culturally, if we're sitting here and we're saying, okay, well, how does this matter? Or what is the relevance of it? If you think about the meaning of color, what the color is, but then apply it to the culture or socially, the color red in the early modern period was used to mark people as basically heretics, or they were against society, they were fornicating in society, that marked them as someone who was a criminal or someone who was bad. And so when we think about the Scarlet Letter, it's very much rooted in the culture and society, not just what people thought, but what was produced, where that word originally came from. So there's much bigger connections here.
This is such a great point by Debbie about knowing the words that we used in earlier times compared to what we use today. I've had several instances recently, for example, when researchers translate the word Tuch, the German word Tuch, as cloth, because nowadays it's just cloth. But then in the 18th century, it was woolen cloth, so specifically. Or, for example, the Estonian word in Estonian helepunane, so light red. And nowadays it's a red, that's light color. But by reading old dictionaries, I found out that in the 18th century, light red actually meant bright red. So the word light also meant bright. So it gives a totally different meaning. And it was used in connection with cushioning red. So this was considered bright.
And that's a very good point as well, thinking about the different cultures and the words that were used, how they described it, and how they either translate or don't translate. It makes me ask the question, is there something to be said about the textile crafts and also traditional dyeing practices if it's tied to cultural memory? Does it say something about the cultural memory of a location or a place?
Yes, definitely. It says a lot about the cultural memory because textiles is heritage and craft knowledge is heritage, and we don't want to lose it. So it past matters. I would like to stress this simple thing, and our project and our research, it helps to preserve this knowledge about how to dye and what kind of textiles they used and what was the meaning of these textiles for the people. And I hope we can cover all these topics.
I think so. That goes into the last couple of questions we have is, how are historical textile craft, past means of color, and traditional dyeing practices relevant today? If your kid came up to you and said, why is this important? Why are you doing this? Because I think this is a very important question that we have to answer. And there's something that I'll share in a moment that made me think, but what do you tell people in terms of why these practices, this knowledge, important today?
Because past matters. I repeat that. And I think we should know from where we are coming. It helps us to understand what is going on today and maybe even predict what is coming next.
It's not a very easy question. It's always difficult to answer. But one very practical thing is it gives, for example, me an opportunity to earn a living by doing something that I'm really interested in and really passionate about. And it also makes me and other textile researchers, I think, better consumers. So, because when we look at the historical textiles, we see how well they are made, how good is the quality of the thread, and that they can survive the usage of many, many years and not look bad. It's not like today that we have to throw away a t-shirt after 3 washes. So it's something that I can appreciate and that I can look for in contemporary clothing that I buy for myself. And I'm willing to pay more money to get a more quality clothing.
I'm absolutely with Liis. I found something that is an absolute passion. I am totally obsessed with looking at the history of natural dyes and working with the natural dyes. They are an all-consuming passion, really. I think it does influence how you look at the modern day attitude to textiles in general, really. And I think it could teach us an awful lot. I think more people need to get caught up in it, really. Maybe that's just an all-consuming passion, end of story. I think people are coming round to it, aren't they? I mean, they're looking at the environmental impact of all the different modern synthetic fibres and how we're going to live with them and how we can replace them and everything. And you only have to look at the past and how well the fibres lasted and how good the clothes were, as Lisa said, to find a solution. But they're even looking at how they can use the fibres I guess it's not the dyes so much, but the fibres as wall insulation for houses, or, kind of how that past and how we've used things in the past, how can we use them in the future? Because we need to go back to being better people.
That's a great way to sum up this question, because if we're thinking about the past matters and also that it's personal, when we think about textile, what we wear, clothing or colors, it's all personal. And it brings to mind this example of one of my favorite movies, The Devil Wears Prada. And there's a scene in there that I've watched many times over, but more when working on textiles and clothing. This scene actually reveals so much more. And it's a moment where they're all in Miranda's office and they're talking about what would go with this cerulean blues like sweater. And Andy's in the back and she's stifling a laugh. And Miranda says, "You probably don't know," and goes through a whole list of, you didn't know that the time that cerulean blue came out, that there was something happening within society that produced this amount of color, or that it showed up in a certain collection. Not knowing the past, what you wear, what you are interested in, comes with the past. It's connected to the past. So it's all about the spinning. It's the creation of it. It's the creation of the dyes. It's the creation of the actual products themselves. And if we are people who value our clothes, at least a very good point about, as a consumer, this is what I'm thinking about, you also have to be aware of that clothing, and the choices that you make also come with how it was produced, why it was produced, where the colors come from. And I think that emphasizes the 2 points that you say. The past matters and it's personal, which makes it relevant to everyone. So I want to conclude by asking a question that I've asked all of our guests, is to get your perspective. What does color mean to you?
Colour lifts the spirit, improves your mood. If you're feeling sad, you can change the mood by changing what you're wearing, or it's just so important. Go out for a walk in the spring and watch the spring flowers coming up, and you just feel better. That's what colour means to me anyway.
For me, color is information, and it can, when you do research, it can tell you a lot about the society, the people who wore the clothing, what they used to get the color. And this is, I guess, because this is what I work with, this is what I think about. What does the color tell me?
I really like that. I think colors do tell you a lot about a person. There are people that say you wear this and all this. And even more recently, I was reading an article where there was a woman who was sitting on a jury, it happened in the US, on a trial. The reasoning she gave afterwards was, she didn't like the color that they were wearing. And it's one of those things that, okay, you're taking this information so you're automatically assuming something about that person, but they're connecting it to the information that they're getting from this person by what they're wearing, the color that they're wearing. And I think that that's a very important point, is that it is information, it's knowledge.
I think that everything is said. It's emotional. It's, of course, it's a possibility for me to express myself and to experience my feelings, but it's also information about others.
Oh, that's a good one. I haven't heard that one yet. Like, it's communicating. You're communicating something. Like, expression is good because you wear something to express, but it's also communicating something. Like, if you, like, it's something to think about. If you wear black, it's like, oh, don't come near me. And if you're wearing yellow or orange, for me, it signals don't go near that person. They're crazy for wearing that. But that's just me. But I think that is something to be said about. It communicates across cultures, across people. That's a great point, Riina. I want to thank you all for joining us for the podcast today, for sharing your experiences and your perspective. We hope everyone out there has enjoyed listening to the podcast, and thank you again.